Thank you. It's pretty common, actually, to have a bad day at work. You might have seen Gallup's most recent State of the Workplace survey, which came up with some shocking numbers, which suggested that only 13% of the workforce globally feels engaged at work. And Finland's about the same. 13%. And then even those of us, let me be heroic here, and even those of us who are in 13% have perhaps as many as 49% of bad days, given what Saku was just saying. I have to confess that I don't speak Finnish. He told me last night what he was saying. So this is really remarkable, you know, that we're spending so much of our lives, and it is a lot of our lives. If you think about your week, it has 168 hours in it. And you think about the fact that you spend maybe a third of that asleep or trying to sleep or thinking about how you should be asleep. And you spend a third of that doing other stuff, laundry, taxes, eating, drinking, dancing, whatever. The other third is work. Or if not actual work, then it's thinking about work, or it's worrying about work, or it's traveling to work, or it's traveling home from work. And if you think about the number of people in this room, that's 20,000 hours a week. And you think about the amount of human potential that is in that 20,000 hours. And if you're not feeling engaged, and if you're not feeling like you're having a good day at work, then what's lost to humanity is pretty enormous. So I got interested in this. You know, you're all here because you're interested in this too. So let's think about something more positive than the half-naked guy in Northern European winter. Let's think about a good day, just for a moment. If you think about in your mind's eye what a good day is for you, a day where you're on form, other people are behaving really well, maybe things are happening that aren't brilliant, but you're kind of rolling with it and, you know, pretty masterful at handling them. Let's just think about that for a second and think about what's the balance between luck and control in what generates that good day as opposed to a bad day. What's the balance between what you control and what is outside your control, what is luck? Okay, I mean, that feels kind of realistic. There is a balance between what you can control and what you can't control. The work that I do is trying to help excavate and illuminate what it is that we can do to shift that balance a little bit further towards control. So you may already be feeling that you have a pretty good degree of influence on whether your day is a good day or not a good day. And I hope to show you that there's at least a few things more that might be in your toolkit that come from cognitive science. And perhaps also give you a language for talking to others who may feel a little bit further down the curve, maybe even towards the zero end, where they feel that things are not in their control. And what I'm going to do is, this is a bit sort of a grand vision, really. I'm looking across the whole of cognitive science and saying, what of this fascinating golden age in neuroscience and behavioral economics and psychology is useful for us who are trying to live a better day at work, and for many of you who are trying to help others have better days at work. And I'm going to talk through these 7 themes, and for each of them, I'm going to try and say one interesting thing, and I'm going to give you 3 practical things that you can take away and do something with immediately. So it's going to be fast and furious, but I'm going to make sure that you have some time to think and reflect on what it is you want to take away. So shall we get started? Yes, okay, all right. So the first thing I want to talk about is perspective. And if you think about, how many of you have had a situation at work where you've had a conversation with a colleague and you think you've understood each other, and you think you've maybe even agreed something, and yet afterwards you have a completely different recollection of the conversation? Yeah, okay, absolutely. It's almost the quintessential professional experience. There is this sense that, you know, you're in one place, people are in another, and you're constantly trying to find this bridge between the two perspectives. It's entirely possible that you can be in a situation where you're in a meeting and you remember something completely different to other people who are in the same meeting, and you think, were we in the same meeting? So how does this happen? This happens because of cognitive filtering. So if you think about the amount of data that's in the room right now, there are trillions of pieces of data in the room right now. If you look at the color of the hairs on the back of the neck of the person sitting in front of you, it's funny, all the eyes go down. And you think about the temperature of each part of your body, and you think about the sound that my voice is making, all of these pieces of data in the room. So your brain is marvelous. It is really fantastic. It is deeply complex and beautiful. But it has to make some choices about what it takes in and what it says is irrelevant. And it's doing this all the time. You know this, right? I mean, you would freeze up if you had to take in all of the data in the room. You'd be distracted by the smallest thing. In fact, you will probably freeze up because you wouldn't be able to move. So the thing is that what we use to decide what's relevant and what's irrelevant is subjective. It's our choice. It comes from our experience. It comes from our expectations. And it comes from things that are really pressing right now. How many of you have heard of the gorilla? Yeah. Okay, so let me give you a different take on the gorilla. Just recently, actually, was a study done this year. There are a bunch of radiologists, the people who save your life by looking at scans and notice that there are abnormalities and say, there's a problem, let's do something about it. Sometimes they are looking for one thing and they actually see something else, and that's even more remarkable. But it's their job. Their job is to look at scans and spot blurs and smudges and figure out what the problem is. So recently, a bunch of radiologists were subjected to some researchers who gave them a ton of lung scans. It was a really familiar task, a sort of lung nodule detection task. And they looked at these scans, and they were real scans, and they spotted, the things that they spotted. In the last of the scans, there was a picture of a gorilla inserted in the lung. And how many of the radiologists do you think saw it? Barely 20% saw this gorilla in the lung. And to be clear, the gorilla was 48 times the size of the average lung nodule. 48 times the size. What's happening is that we are blind to things that don't feel immediately relevant or that we're not expecting to see. Now, just think about what that means. Just think about what that means. Doesn't it suddenly explain how it's possible for two sane and rational people to have a completely different perspective on the same situation? I remember a meeting that I was in about 5 years ago, and it was one of those horrible conference rooms, video conference rooms, which had no windows and no natural light. And it was long and thin, about sort of shape of this stage, because there was a whole panel of screens. And the idea was that you would sit in front of the screen about, maybe this far away, and you'd sit in a line, and then you'd do this video conference. It's a sort of soul-destroying room. You walk in, and it's dark, and it's low ceiling. Do you know the sort of room I mean? Yeah, okay, they're increasingly common in companies' buildings, and they serve a need. I walked in, this meeting it was a project kickoff, it was an important tone-setting kickoff, and I walked in, and the room just depressed me immediately. I just thought, oh no, I can't believe it. And I sat there, and I went on to notice everything that was wrong with the meeting. I noticed that no one really did any proper introductions, there was no scene setting. To my mind, the room was then fraught with tension, people interrupted each other, it was difficult to get to an outcome, and at the end, I just thought this is, archetypal bad meeting. And I wasn't running it, I should say, but I thought that it was important that I give feedback on the fact that this meeting had not been perfect to the colleague who was running it. And I remember him sitting in my office, and I was saying, look, mate, that, I don't think that was good. I did it better than that, but... And he was just looking at me like I was a crazy person. And he had gone in all excited because it was a new project. So he noticed everything that was good. He noticed all the insightful things that people said. He noticed the outcomes that we got to. Neither of us was right, neither of us was wrong. And so there is enormous power in just carrying with you the knowledge that you can never be 100% certain that you are right. Because once you have that, there is a possibility, a world of possibility that opens up where it's just possible to get curious about what common ground you have with someone and where you differ and why that might be. What your expectations are, what your lens is that you're bringing to this particular situation. So if I think about, I said I promised you 3 practical things out of each little section. We're dipping a toe in each of these. Here are 3 things that I would suggest that you noodle on, you consider as possible new keystone habits. I submit for your consideration. So there's one which is just notice in yourself if you're using absolute language. Do you know what I mean by that? Never, always, totally, There's a kind of intensity and certainty and even sort of conceptual arrogance that comes in those words. If you notice people saying that, or you notice yourself saying that, that's a moment to pause and step back and say, is it always like that? Is it never like that? When is it like that? When is it not like that? You don't have to ask a very clever question. You just have to ask the question of, is it always like that? Is it never like that? Second thing is getting beyond right and wrong in arguments. If you just, next time you're in a little bit of a spat, a little bit of a conflict with someone, if you just stop to say, okay, what if there were not a right and wrong? What if we could figure out where we agree and then explore the diverse and extraordinary and wonderful reasons why we may have different views? And then the third thing is to set your intention. Those radiologists, their intention was to find a lung nodule. Their intention was not to find a gorilla. Imagine if at the beginning of every day or every meeting, you were more deliberate in setting your intention. If my intention in that meeting had been to go in and spot everything that was fantastic and that felt like it was going to be a great start to the project, I would have seen something different and I would have behaved differently as a result. Now I'd like to talk about protection. How many of you had a life-threatening experience today? So you didn't, thank goodness. But your brain thinks you did. Your brain thinks you did. And the reason is that we're very, very well geared to spot threats to our existence. I mean, some would say this is, one of the most fundamental aspects of how we think and feel and behave, is scanning constantly for threats. We also scan for rewards, but not as much, because if you think about a car alarm is more useful if it sounds when someone is running a key down the side of it. It's less useful when someone's walking past saying, nice set of wheels. It's more important, historically, if you go back millennia, to survive. And so we're very, very well geared for survival, which is brilliant. Definitely when you're having a survival response, there's something very tangible that's happening in your brain. There's a part of the brain called the amygdala, which many of you will know about, which is part of the limbic system, brain's oldest, part of the brain's older equipment. And it triggers a lightning-fast reaction, which draws energy, blood, glucose away from the prefrontal cortex, conserves it, says, okay, fight, flight, freeze. This is the most important thing. Stop thinking about your navel and the color of your curtains. This is now really, really important. So we have this very inbuilt fight, flight, freeze response that keeps us safe. And I had a horrible experience on a flight last year, and I was in one of those sort of situations where it's a 2-engine plane, one of the engines fails, and you all know that planes can fly on one engine. You're all told that. You're not told how they fly on one engine. It's not quite as stable as when you're having 2 engines. And I had flown from London to San Francisco, and I was on my way from San Francisco to Hawaii. I know your sympathies just dropped there at that point. San Francisco to Hawaii, and I'd been awake for what felt like 3 days, and I was at the point of just, And the moment that we got the message about the engine failure, I was so awake. It was as if I'd had 10 Red Bulls, but without the side effects. I was so alert. Everything was really present. I was conscious of everything, sharp. So, very, very helpful. If you'd asked me at that point to do some complex calculation or to consider the best way to give a colleague feedback about a meeting that wasn't ideal, that would not have been the time, because my higher brain, which is more sophisticated and more nuanced, was offline. I was thinking about fight, flight, freeze. And in the workplace, fight, flight, freeze looks a bit like, the snappy comment. It looks a bit like the kind of, I'm tuning out because this isn't going as I want it to go. I'm just going to check my smartphone. This is happening all the time, that we're responding to threats, not just the life-threatening ones, but the small ones that are a little bit like, oh, my turf is being invaded, or this isn't going quite as I want it to go. This is a threat to my identity. So that's interesting, but this is even more interesting, which is that drawing of energy from the prefrontal cortex makes us a bit less smart. We're just not at that point of being able to do our best thinking. And since this is happening so much in the workplace, and tiniest threats doesn't have to be an engine falling off your plane. It can be, I've just heard that Magnus is doing a project on potatoes, and I'm the expert on potatoes, and I don't understand why he hasn't asked me. And what does this mean? Am I being demoted that I'm not involved in this project? It can be threats like that. So what can you do? The 3 practical things. You want to avoid that sense of panic which takes your prefrontal cortex offline. You want to bring your prefrontal cortex back online. And you want to calm your amygdala down. One thing that has been shown to work very powerfully is to ask yourself a positive question, to ask what's good. So if you're going to a meeting where you're dealing with a crisis and you're thinking about how can we turn this from a disaster into a brand new habit, how can we learn from this? Starting not by saying, okay, well, this is a disaster, isn't it? And, what do we do? Not starting there, but starting by saying, okay, so when have we dealt with crises before? What did we do that was good? How did we learn from that? And what does that tell us about what we do now? Now, that's one example of a positive question. It almost doesn't matter what the question is. I start meetings quite frequently, or I start days quite frequently by saying, okay, what's good? What do I want here? What's the peak going to be? I start a meeting by saying, what's the best thing that's happened since we last met then? It lowers the sense of threat. It allows people to do their best thinking. The second, which is sort of simpler, and maybe your emergency response, is to label your negative emotions, to weaken them. There's a great raft of scientific evidence that just articulating, not wallowing, but articulating what it is that's wrong, how you feel, lowers that amygdala reactivity. So simply saying, you know what, I am feeling, I write, so that's why I'm doing this. I get a piece of paper and I write, I'm feeling hurt that Magnus is doing a project on potatoes and he hasn't asked me for my input because I'm an expert in potatoes, and the way this makes me feel is it makes me feel my expertise is perhaps not valued. And then you can throw away the piece of paper, or you can keep it. The sheer fact of naming the emotion makes a difference. The third thing I would say is obviously just know what's going to trigger that sense of threat. For me, I know that walking into horrible rooms, I know that now, is going to put me in a certain state of mind. What's your trigger? People. We are amazingly social. So if you think right now, what's going on in your mind, the chatter that's going on in your mind, it's like you have this internal Twitter feed. You're saying, well, my chair's a bit wobbly. Is everybody else's a bit wobbly? Is that fair? I've got a share that's not as good as perhaps other people's. And what am I going to do? Am I going to tell people about this? They're going to be interested. And, oh, her hair looks a bit odd. And I wonder, yeah. And she seems to be wearing red. Did she get some kind of memo about the colour scheme? And you've got this chatter. And it's going on. And it's called the default network because it's always on when you're not actively distracted by doing a task. And much of its function is to help us be in the world and figure out how to relate to other people. And things like fairness and status are very much the job of this internal network of chatter. Belonging, also very important. So we've got this amazing amount of brain real estate that is devoted to thinking about social things. But how much do we use it? We sort of think about this as social side of work, and then there's the kind of businessy, analytical part of work. We don't really bring them together as much as we might. One example of how we could do that more is to think, well, what if instead of talking about a talent retention strategy, you talk about it in social terms? We know that we're much better at doing calculations, even mathematical calculations, if the A's and B's and X's and Y's are described in terms of people. So what if your talent retention strategy were less about, well, we're going to do this strategy, and more about, we're going to stop Peter leaving to go and be Saku's ice hockey manager because he's a star and we need to retain him. You're listening in a different way because there's a person in it. It doesn't mean you don't have the hard-edged stuff underneath it too, but if you can cast things in a social way, then you're engaging people's minds much more fully. And to support this, we've got huge amount of social mechanisms in our brains that allow us to be this highly socially attuned animal. So they're all looking up, so I will too. We're drawn to groups, we follow the herd. And I mean, these are phrases we have in the language, but they're really true. If you have one person who has a strong emotion in the room, it's contagious. You probably know that. You're sitting there in a meeting and someone comes in and they're really grumpy, and within a moment, everybody seems to be a bit grumpy. Yeah, it's just it spreads. So this is now measurable. You can see people's cortisol levels. Cortisol is a stress hormone which keeps us alert and alive, but also causes a lot of other problems. It syncs up in groups. We're incredibly contagious emotionally. Just think about that. I had a meeting in Paris. I was coaching 4 people in a group, and the 4th person hadn't turned up. And there were 3 people there, and we were having a good session. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I mean, we were. It was a good conversation, and they're quite sort of assertive guys. But it was, we were having a really good meaty session. 4th person comes in, and she's clearly really, really stressed. And she's a ball of negative emotion. She comes in and she kind of flings herself down in the chair and she's, oh. And within a moment, we'd been talking about this workshop that we were organising. It was going to be a few months later. And she was saying, what workshop? I don't know about a workshop. Workshop's in my diary. Is this in my diary? I don't know. And I swear, it took about 1 or 2 minutes. I'll give them that. It took 1 or 2 minutes before the other 3, who were previously perfectly content and even talking about this workshop, to start saying, yeah, they with their phones out, it's not in my diary either. But it was in their diary. We were just talking about it. It was remarkable. It was the purest experiment that I've ever seen, of just seeing this spread. So what did I do? I knew about contagion, and I knew that the strongest emotion is the thing that infects the room. So I thought, okay, I've got to sit here and I've got to radiate love or something. I mean, I could have picked any positive emotion, but I needed something that was really simple in the moment because I was sitting there with these people and I was thinking, I've got to. So I sat there and I just thought, okay, I'm going to push out. And of course, you can't just say the word love. You have to think of something positive. So I think of my husband. I think of, how fantastic, how fascinating. What can I learn from this? It's wonderful work that I'm doing. It's just how amazing to see contagion like this. It's just, and I'm pushing this out. It worked, is all I can say. It took a couple of minutes, and then it worked. And I've used it a lot since then. Second thing is find the little things that are in common. Don't skip it, because people get processed as a threat. unless you find the little things that are in common. We saw before what happens when something is perceived as a threat. So find a little thread of belonging, find a shred of a shared goal, and go back to that. I use that as well in this session. And then back to the talent retention strategy. Illustrate your ideas using real people. Yes, have the numbers, and yes, have the charts, but start by telling the story about the people. Now, this is a bit more about behavioral economics than neuroscience, but really the boundaries between the two are blurring. When behavioral economics is done well, it really is spoken about in terms that really show an understanding of how our brains work. So this is about the present. This is our bias towards the present. So if you think about this glass of water, this is my glass of water. Now, I have this. And if you ask me, how much do I value this glass of water at? I will tell you that it's worth $2. That you'd have to give me $2 to get me to give it to you. How much would I pay for this? $1. Actually, slightly less than $1. Because I don't already have it. We love what we already have. We love what we already have. Can you imagine what that's like in an organization where you're trying to get change to happen? It's irrational in one sense. It's not irrational in the sense that we love things that are concrete, because if you think about evolutionary biology, it was good to have things that we actually knew we had, rather than possible future glasses of water, which we may not have in future. We're geared very well to think about concrete things, much less well to think about abstract things. And so what that gives us is a loss aversion. We don't like losing what we have. It gives us a status quo bias. We don't really like change that much, some people more than others. And gives us endowment effects. We like to keep what we have. We overvalue it. So what can you do? One of the things that's so fascinating about this is that we're so biased to thinking about the present versus the future that when we think about ourselves in the future, you see much the same brain activity as when you think about a stranger. It's remarkable. So what changed it? There was a group of researchers around a guy called Al Hirschfeld who were trying to get people to save more, think about how you might get people to save more for their pensions. The thing that worked was showing people a picture of themselves digitally aged. I know, I don't fancy that myself, but it would make me save more, apparently, quite a lot more. And this is where I think, the answer is. It's how do you make the future as real as you can? How do you make it very, very present? And in this case, making your face age until you're, the point at which you're going to draw a pension worked very well. In a work context, what does that mean? It means that when you're trying to persuade someone, or even yourself, you have to describe the outcome very vividly. If possible, put people in it, back to the social. Bring it to life. How else can you bring the future into the present? You can make public commitments. And you'll see some of the connections with what Charles was saying. Make public commitments now. That makes it very real now. And the last one, I would say, is not obvious. Because we are so geared towards the status quo, we think about the pros and cons of doing something, taking a job, having a difficult conversation. We don't think much at all about the pros and cons of not taking the job, or the pros and cons of not having the tricky conversation that we're avoiding. And the simple fact of asking yourself the pros and cons of each is tremendously clarifying. It doesn't mean that you're going to then take the job, or you're definitely going to go and have the difficult conversation, but it corrects for a bit of a blind spot that we all have. Processing. So our brains are like computers, very beautiful computers. They're more than that, of course. But there's one thing that is similar, which is that if we have too much that's coming in, we do crash, we do hang. For those of you who are using PCs, this is your kind of hourglass. So we know that we get tremendously stressed by having too much coming in. There's a part of the brain called the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the DACC, which is the kind of the brain's PA. It sort of is responsible for deciding what to do, what to prioritize. Also a lot of other things. I mean, you learn over time that every part of the brain has multiple functions, and it's more about systems than it is about specific parts of the brains. But certainly there is something which will make your brain work very hard, which is giving lots of conflicting things that it needs to respond to at once, like an email inbox. So what is there that we do? We tend to juggle, right? We juggle. Like there's some of you who are kind of trying to do multiple things right now. I mean, in some ways you all are, right? Because you're breathing and you're listening. What's interesting is that we really do find it difficult to parallel process anything that's meaningful. So there are things that can be unconscious, that can be very habitual, that we can do in parallel. But if we're trying to do two really meaningful things at the same time, we've got one attentional bottleneck in the brain, which means that when you think you're doing two things at once, you're switching. And switching is okay, except that if it adds up, then you are using mental energy on the switching. And just like anything where you're trying to juggle more than one thing when you're switching, is you slow down because you're losing the time as you switch from one thing to the other. Infinitesimal, but it's there. And you will make more errors on simple tasks. So what do you do with this? I mean, you can't change the way that the world works. You've got all of this stuff around you. You don't like to think of multitasking being procrastination in disguise because it makes you feel like you're getting on top of things, you're feeling busy. But the small cost of slowing you down actually means that you're losing some time that you're putting in. Well, I think that there are a couple of things that we need to know. One is that if we want to get into really creative space, if you want to do really good thinking, using more joined up thinking is the way to go. But there's also subconscious brain power that we don't use that much, very deliberately, for obvious reasons. It's subconscious. But if you think about time that you were in the shower and you suddenly came up with an idea, or you slept and you came up with an idea or a solution in the morning, does that happen to you? You go for a walk, you take a step away, and then suddenly the idea pops up. Your subconscious, which is subject to a lot of biases, is also pretty amazing, and it's able to do sort of non-linear processing that your more conscious mind isn't so good at. So if you've got a lot of complex stuff that you're trying to solve and figure out an answer to, taking a step back from the solution and letting your subconscious work on it, and then come back, has been shown, is quite a new area of research, has been shown to make a big difference to the quality of the decision that you make. So this is pretty powerful. So this is not saying you don't need to do integrative thinking. You do. But the way that you do it is not by going like this the whole time. It's about engaging on something, stepping away, and then re-engaging on it. So what I would say is batch activities together that are kind of similar, because that reduces switching costs. Zone your day. You're never going to stop completely from switching from one thing to the next. But the more you group similar tasks together, then the less you're going to waste in switching from one to another. Your working memory, your poor working memory, can only hold maybe 3 or 4 chunks of information at a time. So the moment that you have a flashing light or a notification, one of your chunks is gone on that little distraction. So husband your precious, scarce working memory more carefully. Reduce distractions. When you're trying to get to depth on a particular topic, switch things off so that you can really, really concentrate. And I know that this is a big area of debate, and how do you actually do that and so on. I'm happy to talk more about that in a second. And then when you have a really complex task, how about planning a break rather than powering through? Plan to come back and revisit rather than powering through. Progress. I'm going to not spend too much time on this because it really links very nicely to what Charles was saying. And it's It's in this area of saying, once upon a time we thought that when you were a teenager things were pretty much fixed, and that, adults didn't really develop all that much, their brains didn't change all that much. Well, thank goodness that's not the case, because as a teenager I was spending most of my time trying to get my hair to stand up with hair mousse. And, that would have been a different life to have stayed in that place. I'm very glad that I moved on. Neuroplasticity, we're so much more flexible than we thought that we were. Even paying attention to something changes our brain. We have to be deliberate about it, but even paying attention to something changes our brain. So the fact that you're now paying attention to these dogs with hats on changes your brain. So that tomorrow, if you see a dog with a hat on, you're much more likely to spot it and really not guerrilla it out, but actually notice it and pay attention. The other thing that's really nice about this is that it's not just that we're designed to grow and to develop, but we love it. We get a hit of dopamine from learning something new, a little novelty, something that feels good because it's new and it teaches us something that's new because it's just new. I mean, I'm not saying, the engine falling off the plane was new. That's not the characteristics of the kind of thing that we're talking about here. But something mildly positive and new, huge boost. So what if we were to use that? If you look at your diary and you think, oh gosh, this is one of those days, it's not going to be the best of days, there are 3 meetings I can already tell are going to be difficult, or there's a particular task that I know is just not the sort of thing that I'm best at. So what can you do? Asking yourself, what can I learn from this? Brings this reward online for you. And it attunes you to the novelty of what might happen, even in the dullest of meetings. So the question might be, what can I learn from this? Well, I can learn how to deal with, people walking out of a session. I can learn to deal with the fact that the lights are going to go out. I can deal with the fact that I'm going to learn how to have a video conference without freaking out that there's no natural light. Just simply asking yourself, what can I learn from this? The more that you can let people work things out for themselves so that it feels newer, it feels more exciting. They get more of a hit from that than being told. If you think about if you're doing a crossword or a puzzle and you have that aha moment, that insight, how different that feels to someone leaning over your shoulder and saying, I think 4 across is geek. It's like, yes, you still have the answer, but it feels very different. And then because we have this desire, this pleasure that comes from growth and development, then identifying small steps in big goals so that you get a little boost from a sense of progress, breaking down the big goals makes a big difference. Now it only occurred to me last night that this photo looks a bit like he's going to punch himself. But he's certainly in touch with his body. And that's what I want to say, especially for people who work with their minds more than their hands. There's an error that a lot of us make, which is we separate. We think that our brains are separate from our body. We think that our body is sort of a container for our brain. We like our body to look good, but we think it's okay to go without sleep until the weekend, or we say, well, we're too busy to exercise. We have this sense of trade-off. You work hard or you look after yourself. And I guess I have a bit of a manifesto pledge here, which is that there's so much evidence now that there is no trade-off. If you go without sleep for a complete night, your IQ drops by 10 points. I mean, I'm saying certain studies have shown this, but the accumulation of evidence is really compelling. If you are short of sleep over 2 weeks, then your cognitive impairment's about the same as if you were drunk. And if you think about exercise, we know that exercise helps us think more clearly, sometimes not immediately afterwards. There's lots of mixed results on this, but certainly afterwards, like the day after that. 20 minutes of exercise, it turns out, is enough, which is good for me anyway. And then we have this 90-minute cycle that our bodies are on, which is remarkable, you know, when you think about the fact that we know that sleep is on a 90-minute cycle. Well, so are we during the day. So that all of our physiological systems are on this cycle. And if we don't refresh ourselves every 90 minutes, well, you know what happens. You kind of, you know, you're interested, but you just can't pay attention. Or you're not interested, and you're just fidgety, and you just notice how it feels. The attention goes because your body needs a break. It's called the basic rest activity cycle. So my manifesto suggestion to you is no trade-off at all. Check your rhetoric. The number of times that you think, oh, I just power on, I'll do another hour, I'll do another 2 hours, you're almost certainly going to be better when you revisit it the next day with some sleep. And that sounds like motherhood, right? But now we have the evidence that really suggests that this is true. Respect the 90-minute boundary. Don't power through. Get up, stretch, walk around, take a moment to refresh your body's systems. And the last point is a fun one, which is the link between the body and the brain is such that if you smile, even if it's a fake smile, it will release serotonin, it will lift your mood. And if you pose strongly and make yourself feel bigger, like a gorilla if you want that word again, that releases testosterone and gives you a boost in confidence. So if anyone saw me in the ladies' toilets earlier on and I was grinning and standing like a sumo wrestler, you'll know why. So this biofeedback is a remarkable thing. It's definitely something which offsets the sometimes being a little bit short of sleep. So that's my 7 Ps: perspective, protection, people, present, processing, progress, physicality. I hope that's been useful, interesting, and I think Saki's probably going to ask me some questions now. Thank you.